The echo of Julian Sterling's voice snapped across the polished epoxy floor of Hangar 4, sharp enough to make 3 junior technicians flinch and drop their wrenches. The noise swallowed the ambient hum of the Blackwood Executive Terminal. Julian, the vice president of operations for Cobalt Aeronautics, stood with his chest puffed out, his face flushed and ugly mottled red. He was pointing a trembling finger at the chest of a man in a faded canvas work jacket. "You do not touch the aircraft, Kinsley. You do not approach the aircraft. You haul the chocks, you empty the waste bins, and you stay out of the sightlines of the investors." The man taking the screaming was Garrett Kinsley. He did not flinch. He did not raise his hands in defense. He simply stood there, absorbing the verbal assault with the absolute unsettling stillness of a man who had survived storms that Julian Sterling lacked the imagination to even dream of. But Garrett's right hand was moving. It was angled slightly backward, his broad, calloused fingers gently resting over the ears of a 6-year-old girl, Maya. She was tucked entirely behind Garrett's right leg, pressing her face into the worn denim of his jeans. She was holding a plastic yellow airplane in one hand, her knuckles white. She was trembling. Garrett's thumb rhythmically, silently stroked the side of her head, a physical barrier between his daughter and the screaming executive. Standing 40 feet away, watching from the elevated glass walkway of the VIP lounge, was Sloane Whitcroft. Sloane was the chief executive officer of Cobalt Aeronautics. She was 34, wore an immaculate charcoal overcoat, and possessed a reputation so cold it was said she could freeze aviation fuel with a sustained glance. She demanded perfection, fired without hesitation, and viewed emotional vulnerability as a tactical defect. She was supposed to be watching the unveiling of the Ether 9, Cobalt's multi-billion-dollar prototype aircraft, a machine designed to revolutionize vertical takeoff for the global elite. Instead, she found her eyes locked entirely on the ramp worker in the canvas jacket. Julian stepped closer, invading Garrett's personal space. "You bypassed a security cordon to put your filthy hands on a carbon fiber rotor housing that costs more than you will earn in 3 lifetimes. Give me one reason I shouldn't have terminal security throw you in a holding cell right now." Garrett looked at Julian. His voice, when it came, was not defensive. It was low, resonant, and entirely stripped of fear. "The ambient temperature dropped 12 degrees in the last hour," Garrett said calmly. "The Ether 9 uses a variable pitch titanium alloy in the rotor sleeve. If you run the pre-flight spool under these atmospheric conditions without recalculating the thermal contraction on the primary bearing, the housing won't just fail, Julian. It will shear off at 400 rotations per minute. It will kill everyone standing in a 50-foot radius." Julian stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled onto a dock. The sheer technical precision of the statement coming from a man who was paid $18 an hour to wash landing gear paralyzed him for exactly 3 seconds. Then, the arrogance rushed back to fill the void. "You are a janitor in a mechanic's shirt," Julian spat. "You're fired. Get your trash out of my hangar. And take the kid with you before I call child services for bringing a minor into a restricted heavy machinery zone." The words hit the air like a physical strike. Garrett's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. For a fraction of a second, Sloane, watching from the glass, saw something terrifying flash in the ramp worker's eyes, a lethal calculated darkness that did not belong to a man who swept hangar floors. It was the look of a man who knew exactly how to dismantle a threat, but Maya whimpered. Instantly, the darkness vanished. Garrett dropped to one knee, turning his back entirely on Julian, a profound display of disrespect that made the executive turn purple. Garrett didn't care. The rest of the world ceased to exist. "Hey, little bird," Garrett whispered, his voice suddenly thick with a warm, enveloping softness that seemed to change the gravity in the room. He pulled Maya's small, shaking hands away from her face. "You remember what we talked about? About loud noises? They're just empty clouds," Maya sniffled, clutching her yellow toy. "They make a lot of thunder, but they can't hurt you." "Exactly," Garrett smiled, wiping a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "And what do we do when it thunders? We fly above it, that's my girl." Garrett stood up, lifting Maya effortlessly into his left arm. She buried her face in his neck. He adjusted her weight, kissed the top of her head, and turned back to Julian. "I'll clear my locker," Garrett said. His voice was dead again, completely devoid of the warmth he had just poured into his daughter. "But do not spool those engines today." He turned and walked toward the exit doors. He didn't look back. He didn't ask for severance. He carried his daughter through the sea of silent mechanics and out into the biting Portland rain. From the walkway, Sloane Whitcroft felt a strange, uncomfortable tightening in her chest. It was a sensation she usually reserved for plummeting quarterly earnings, not the firing of a low-level contractor. She watched the way Garrett walked, balanced, perfectly postured, moving with a disciplined grace that did not match his job title. She descended the steel staircase to the hangar floor. Julian immediately smoothed his suit, pasted on a sycophantic smile, and turned to greet her. Mrs. Whitcroft, apologies for the disturbance. Just clearing out some insubordinate dead weight before the investor showcase. Sloane ignored him. She walked past his outstretched hand, her heels clicking sharply against the epoxy, and stopped exactly where Garrett had been standing. She looked up at the massive gleaming rotor assembly of the Ether 9. Resting on the metal staging tray beside the aircraft was a small, grease-stained piece of cardboard. Garrett had left it there. Sloane picked it up. It wasn't a random warning. It was a mathematical equation. A highly advanced thermodynamic load calculation, scrawled in neat, precise architectural handwriting. It factored in atmospheric pressure, titanium shear stress, and ambient cold. At the bottom, beneath a complex string of numbers that most senior engineers would need software to run, were 3 words. Tolerance limit exceeded, and beneath that, a small, intricate symbol. A winged insignia with a sword through it. Sloane stared at the cardboard, her breath caught perfectly still in her throat. She recognized the math, and she recognized the insignia. It was the private operational seal of the United States Armed Forces' most classified experimental aviation unit, a unit that officially did not exist. She slowly turned to look at the hangar doors, but the man and his daughter were already gone. Sloane's fingers tightened around the grease-stained cardboard. The silence in the hangar felt heavy, thick with the unspent energy of the massive machine resting in the center of the room. Julian's voice broke the quiet, echoing from the staging area. He was waving a brightly colored signaling wand, addressing the lead mechanic. Spool it up. Let's get these blades turning before the board members start asking why they flew to Oregon for a static display. Stop! Sloane did not yell. She didn't need to. Her voice carried a specific, chilling frequency that commanded instant obedience. The lead mechanic froze, his hand hovering over the ignition sequence panel. Julian whipped around, his face stretching into a mask of confused panic. Mrs. Whitcroft? Julian stammered, jogging toward her. Is there a problem? We are 3 minutes from the demonstration window. Sloane walked past him, not offering a single glance. She stopped at the edge of the safety perimeter, looking up at the titanium rotor housing Garrett had warned about. The metal gleamed under the industrial lights, flawless and deadly. The test is canceled, Sloane said, her voice dropping the temperature in the room. Drain the fuel lines. Lock the hangar doors. Nobody touches this aircraft until I bring in an outside structural integrity team. Julian's jaw dropped. Contold? Sloane, the investors are in the glass gallery right now. You can't just pull the plug because some disgruntled janitor got his feelings hurt and tried to scare us. Sloane finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were devoid of any warmth. If you ever speak to me with that tone again, Julian, you won't just be looking for a new job. You will be looking for a new industry. The aircraft is grounded. She turned on her heel and walked out, leaving a dozen engineers and 1 terrified executive standing in stunned silence. She slipped the piece of cardboard into the deep pocket of her overcoat. The entire walk to her top-floor office, her pulse hammered a strange, erratic rhythm against her ribs. Once the heavy oak doors of her office clicked shut, the icy facade cracked, just a fraction. She leaned against her mahogany desk, pulling the cardboard out and staring at the military insignia again. A winged sword. She had grown up around aviation magnates and defense contractors. She knew what that symbol meant. It belonged to a ghost unit, men who were dropped into the darkest corners of the earth and brought impossible machines back in one piece. Her intercom buzzed. It was her assistant. Mrs. Whitcroft, the nanny is here with your son. Sloane took a sharp breath, instantly smoothing her coat. Send him in. The doors pushed open, and a small 7-year-old boy named Elias stumbled into the room. He was clutching a heavy winter coat, his chest heaving, his face pale and streaked with fresh tears. Outside, the Portland sky had darkened into a bruised purple, and a sudden, violent crack of thunder rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows. Elias flinched violently, dropping his coat and covering his ears. He let out a sharp, panicked cry, backing himself into the corner of the vast, intimidating office. Sloane's heart seized. The ruthless CEO who had just grounded a billion-dollar project, without blinking suddenly felt completely, utterly helpless. She crossed the room, her high heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floor, which only seemed to scare Elias more. Elias, stop, Sloane said, her voice tight, rigid with an anxiety she didn't know how to suppress. It's just weather. The building has a reinforced steel frame. You are perfectly safe. Look at me. She reached out, trying to pull his hands away from his ears, but he resisted, curling tighter into a ball on the floor. He was crying harder now, terrified by the noise, terrified by the massive room, and completely unreachable to her. Sloane knelt beside him, her hands trembling. She possessed millions of dollars, she controlled the skies, but she could not comfort her own child. She felt a suffocating wave of failure wash over her. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to make him feel safe. In that agonizing moment, an image flashed unbidden into her mind. Garrett. She saw the broad-shouldered man in the faded canvas jacket dropping to one knee in the middle of a hostile hangar. She saw the effortless, protective way he had shielded his daughter, the gentle sweep of his thumb, the low, steady warmth in his voice that had instantly dissolved the little girl's fear. He hadn't offered logic. He hadn't offered facts. He had offered an immovable wall of safety. Sloane swallowed hard, the contrast burning her chest. Across town, inside the rain-streaked windows of the Rusty Anchor Cafe, Garrett Kinsley slid a plate of golden fries across a laminated table. Maya was sitting in the vinyl booth, her legs swinging back and forth, her yellow plastic airplane resting next to a glass of milk. Garrett poured a packet of sugar into his black coffee. He looked exactly the same as he had in the hangar, steady, quiet, his posture holding a relaxed vigilance. "Dad?" Maya asked, dipping a fry into a pool of ketchup. "Are we going to be okay?" The angry man was really loud. Garrett met her eyes. His expression softened, radiating a quiet, absolute certainty. "We are always okay, little bird." The angry man just forgot his manners. "He can't touch us. Do you have to find a new place to clean?" Garrett took a slow sip of his coffee. He looked out the window at the heavy rain hitting the pavement. "Yeah, I think I'll find a new place." Back at the corporate tower, Elias had finally exhausted himself, falling asleep on the leather sofa in the corner of Sloane's office. Sloane sat at her desk, the silence of the room pressing heavily against her. She opened her laptop and accessed the company's HR database. She typed in the name Garrett Kinsley. The file loaded. It was shockingly thin. An address in a dilapidated industrial district, a generic high school diploma, but it was the employment history that made her blood run cold. Everything prior to 3 years ago was blacked out, redacted. Entire decades erased by heavy digital black lines. The only visible text was a single, terrifying classification code. Sloane stared at the screen, the hair on her arms standing up. He wasn't a janitor, he was a weapon, and someone had forced him into hiding. Sloane Whitcroft possessed a mind that could process a hostile corporate takeover in minutes, but the sound of her own son's panicked breathing paralyzed her completely. The grand atrium of the Cresswell Towers was a sea of flashing cameras, clinking champagne glasses, and overwhelming noise. It was the annual Pacific Northwest Aviation Gala, an event Sloane was required to attend. Because her nanny had quit without notice that afternoon, a terrified 7-year-old Elias was clutching the fabric of her expensive evening gown, his small body trembling violently against her leg. Sloane hated feeling helpless. She was a woman who dictated the future of global airspace, a woman who fired executives without a second thought. But standing under the massive crystal chandeliers, surrounded by hundreds of elite investors, she could not figure out how to make her child stop crying. A sudden, sharp crash echoed through the atrium as a waiter dropped a silver tray of glassware. Elias let out a sharp cry and bolted. He didn't run toward the exit. Blinded by panic, the little boy sprinted directly toward the unfinished staging area on the far side of the ballroom, where a massive, heavy iron display casing was being hoisted into place by a frantic logistics crew. "Ilias!" Sloane screamed, her heart seizing. She lunged forward, her high heels slipping on the polished marble. She pushed past a group of startled billionaires, her pulse hammering in her throat. Elias tripped over a thick, black power cable and fell hard against the base of the iron display. The impact shook the temporary support legs. High above him, a heavy steel anchor groaned under the sudden shift in weight. The thick metal chain slipped off its hook. The entire iron casing, weighing thousands of pounds, began to tip forward, directly toward the crying boy on the floor. Sloane froze. Time slowed to a torturous crawl. She was too far away. The security guards were too slow. All her wealth, all her power, all her authority meant absolutely nothing. She was going to watch her son get crushed, and she could not buy a single second of time to stop it. A blur of motion cut through the crowd. It was a man in a plain black work polo. He moved with a terrifying predatory speed, leaping over a velvet rope and sliding across the marble floor. He didn't reach for Elias. He reached for the falling iron. Garrett Kinsley slammed his shoulder directly into the tipping steel frame. The sound of metal hitting bone was sickening. The sheer weight of the display forced Garrett down onto one knee, the muscles in his arms bulging, his jaw locked in a rigid line. The heavy iron ground against his shoulder, threatening to snap his spine, but he did not yield. He braced his heavy work boots against the marble, becoming a human pillar of immovable strength. He held it. He held thousands of pounds of dead weight entirely on his own, his face completely calm, while the panicked logistics crew rushed forward with backup chains to secure the load. Once the display was locked safely into place, Garrett stepped back. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for a medic. He simply rolled his right shoulder, taking a slow, deep breath. Then he looked down at Elias. The little boy was curled into a tight ball on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, his hands clamped over his ears to block out the screaming crowd. Sloane finally reached the staging area, her chest heaving, tears blurring her vision. She dropped to the floor, her hands hovering uselessly over her son. She didn't know where to touch him. She didn't know what to say. She was terrified of making it worse. Garrett knelt beside her. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the cameras. He did not even look at Sloane. "Hey," Garrett said. His voice was incredibly low, vibrating with a deep, earthy warmth that seemed to cut entirely through the chaotic noise of the room. Elias peeked through his fingers, still shaking. Garrett reached out with slow, deliberate movements. He didn't crowd the boy. He gently pressed 2 fingers against the inside of Elias's wrist, finding his pulse. It was a precise, measured touch. "Your heart is beating like a racehorse," Garrett whispered, a small, gentle smile touching his lips. "That means your engine is running too hot. We need to throttle down. Breathe with me. In through the nose, hold it for 3. Elias stared at the strange man. There was something so profoundly safe about Garrett's presence, an emotional anchor in the middle of a storm. Slowly, the little boy lowered his hands. He took a shaky breath, mimicking Garrett. "Good," Garrett said, his voice entirely steady. "You're safe. Nothing is going to fall." Sloane watched in absolute awe. Her hands were still trembling, but Garrett's were perfectly still. He was providing a fierce, unconditional safety that she, with all her resources, could not summon. She stared at the side of his face, realizing the man she had allowed to be fired hours earlier had just saved her world. Before she could speak, a harsh, arrogant voice cut through the tender moment. "What is this?" Julian Sterling pushed his way to the front of the crowd, wearing a custom tuxedo, his face twisted in a sneer. He looked at Garrett kneeling on the floor, then looked at Sloane. "I don't believe this," Julian scoffed loudly, ensuring the nearby investors could hear him. "Are you stalking us, Kinsley? You get fired from cleaning my hangars this morning, so you put on a cheap shirt and sneak into a high-security charity gala to beg for your job back?" The crowd murmured. Sloane felt a surge of pure fury rise in her chest, but before she could order Julian out of the building, Garrett slowly stood up. He brushed the dust off his knees. He looked at the arrogant executive. Garrett did not raise his voice. He did not show an ounce of intimidation. "I'm working the freight elevator, Julian," Garrett said quietly. "Vanguard Event Logistics needed a heavy-load operator for the evening. You're a liability," Julian snapped, stepping closer, trying to use his height to intimidate the calm father. "You have no business being within 50 feet of these people. Get out before I have you arrested for trespassing." Garrett didn't move. He looked at Julian with eyes that had seen the darkest parts of the world. "The structural load capacity of that display is rated for static weight only," Garrett said, his voice cold, steady, and devastatingly precise. "Your event planners placed it over a hollow ventilation shaft. The floor vibration from the crowd compromised the anchor hooks. Next time you want to impress a room full of people, check the ground you're standing on before you try to build something heavy on it." Julian opened his mouth, but no words came out. The sheer authority in Garrett's voice completely dismantled him in front of the entire room. Garrett turned his back on the executive. He looked down at Sloane, who was still kneeling beside Elias. For a brief second, their eyes met, the cold, untouchable CEO and the quiet, grounded laborer. "Keep him away from the staging areas," Garrett said softly, the warmth returning instantly to his voice. "He's a brave kid. He just needs a little quiet." Without waiting for a thank you, Garrett turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the service hallway. Sloane stayed on the floor, holding her son tightly against her chest. She looked at the heavy iron casing, then at the empty hallway where Garrett had vanished. Her mind raced back to the redacted military file on her computer. She knew with absolute certainty that the man who had just braced a falling steel frame with a shattered shoulder was not a freight elevator operator. The ride back to the penthouse was the quietest Sloane Whitcroft had ever experienced. Rain lashed against the tinted windows of her private town car, blurring the neon lights of the city into long streaks of cold color. In the back seat, Elias was fast asleep, his small head resting heavily against her side. His breathing was finally steady. Sloane looked down at her own hands. They were trembling. She had negotiated multi-billion-dollar government defense contracts without a single spike in her heart rate. She had dismantled rival corporations with a polite, empty smile. But watching that massive iron display tip toward her son had shattered every defense mechanism she possessed. In that terrible moment, she had been utterly, completely powerless. And then came Garrett Kinsley. She closed her eyes, the chaotic image replaying in her mind, the sheer, impossible strength, the sickening sound of heavy steel grinding violently against his shoulder. The way his face had locked into a mask of pure, immovable stone. He hadn't even flinched. But it wasn't the physical strength that haunted her. It was what happened after the danger had passed. When Elias was trapped in a full-blown panic attack, deaf to her own desperate pleading, Garrett had simply knelt down. 2 fingers on a pulse, a low, warm voice. I've got you. In 10 seconds, a man wearing a cheap work shirt had provided a level of emotional safety that all of Sloane's wealth and power could not buy. By the time the car pulled up to her private residence, Sloane's lingering fear had metabolized into something much more dangerous. Pure, calculated fury. At 8 o'clock the next morning, the executive boardroom of Cobalt Aeronautics was incredibly tense. Julian Sterling stood at the head of the long mahogany table, holding a presentation remote. He was sweating through his expensive silk suit, attempting to spin the near-fatal disaster at the gala as a minor logistical miscommunication to the senior investors. The event coordinators have been severely reprimanded, Julian said smoothly, flashing a confident smile that completely failed to reach his eyes. And I can assure the board that our brand reputation remains pristine. It was simply a freak accident. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. The temperature in the room instantly plummeted. Sloane walked in. She was wearing a tailored black suit, her expression carved from absolute ice. The room fell dead silent. Julian lowered the remote, his arrogant smile faltering. We were just reviewing the shut up. The 2 words were barely a whisper, but they hit the quiet room like a physical blow. The investors stared in shock. Sloane didn't sit down. She walked slowly to the head of the table, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, stopping mere inches away from Julian. You placed a massive steel structure over a hollow floor vent to make your presentation look more dramatic, Sloane said, her voice terrifyingly level. You bypassed the safety review. You endangered hundreds of people. You nearly killed my son. Julian swallowed hard, taking a desperate step back. Sloane, it was Vanguard Logistics. They signed off on the load bearing. A man you fired yesterday morning, Sloane interrupted, her eyes locking onto Julian with predatory intensity. A man you humiliated on my hangar floor stepped in and held up 3,000 pounds of iron with his bare shoulder to save my child's life. And while he was bleeding, you tried to have him arrested for trespassing. Julian opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The investors began to murmur urgently, exchanging alarmed glances. Pack your office, Julian, Sloane said. You are terminated. If you ever come within 50 feet of a Cobalt Aeronautics facility again, I will personally see to it that you are dragged out in handcuffs. Julian's face went entirely pale. He looked at the board members for support, but they were staring at their notepads, completely terrified of the woman standing at the head of the table. He turned and practically ran out of the room. Sloane turned to her head of private security, a broad-shouldered man sitting silently in the corner. Marcus, find him. Find who, Miss Whitcroft? Garrett Kinsley. It took Marcus exactly 3 hours. 30 miles outside the city limits, hidden behind a rust-covered chain-link fence, sat the Blackwood Municipal Airfield. It was a dying, forgotten strip of cracked asphalt used mostly for crop dusters and cheap cargo runs. The freezing morning rain had turned the ground into thick gray mud. Garrett Kinsley was standing in the pouring rain, wearing the exact same canvas jacket. He was hauling massive, heavy steel drums of aviation oil out of the back of a delivery truck, manually lifting dead weight that should have required a forklift. His right shoulder, the one that had taken the brutal impact of the falling iron display the night before, moved with a slight, rigid stiffness. But he didn't stop working. Inside the drafty, unheated manager's office, peering through a dirty, rain-streaked window, sat Maya. She was bundled in a heavy wool blanket, carefully drawing in a small notebook, keeping her large eyes fixed entirely on her father out in the storm. Standing on the covered loading dock, holding a cup of hot coffee under a large umbrella, was the airfield manager, an overweight, bitter man named Broderick Hayes. "Pick up the pace, Kinsley," Broderick shouted aggressively over the sound of the rain. "I'm paying you minimum wage to move those barrels, not to take a vacation. You want to keep your kids sitting in my office, you work twice as fast." Garrett didn't say a single word. He hoisted another heavy steel drum, his jaw tight, his worn boots sinking deeply into the freezing mud. He carried the humiliation the exact same way he carried the crushing weight. With absolute, unbroken silence, he was a father. Fathers did what they had to do to keep their children fed. A sleek, armored black SUV pulled through the rusted gates of the airfield. Its heavy tires crushed the gravel as it rolled slowly past the broken-down planes, coming to a smooth, intimidating stop right in front of the muddy loading dock. Broderick stopped yelling. He lowered his coffee cup, staring blankly at the vehicle. It cost more than his entire miserable airfield was worth. The back door opened. Sloane Whitcroft stepped out into the freezing rain. She didn't have an umbrella. She didn't care about her expensive overcoat getting ruined. She stared directly at the man hauling the steel drum in the mud. And stepping out right behind her, clutching a small blue stuffed bear, was 7-year-old Elias. He looked past the muddy asphalt, past the shouting manager, and locked eyes immediately with Garrett. Garrett slowly set the heavy drum down. He wiped his greasy hands on his jacket, the freezing rain running down his face, and looked at the powerful CEO standing in the dirt of his new reality.
Miss
Whitcroft, Garrett said quietly, his voice instantly softening. You shouldn't have brought him out here. It's too cold for the boy. Before Sloane could answer, Broderick stomped down the metal stairs of the loading dock, his face turning an angry shade of red. He didn't recognize the famous CEO. He just saw an unwanted interruption on his property. Hey, Broderick barked, pointing a thick, accusing finger at Garrett. Did I tell you to take a break? I don't care who your friends are, Kinsley. Get back to work right now, or you and that kid of yours are out on the street. Sloane slowly turned her head to look at Broderick. The absolute, chilling darkness in her eyes made the airfield manager freeze instantly in his tracks. Broderick Hayes stood on the edge of the loading dock, the freezing Oregon rain pasting his thin hair to his forehead. He had his mouth open, ready to hurl another insult at the laborer in the mud, but the words died in his throat. The woman stepping out of the armored vehicle did not belong in this part of the world. Her black overcoat cost more than Broderick's entire annual operating budget. The way she moved, with a terrifying, unhurried grace, spoke of a power so absolute it made the air around her feel thin. Sloane Whitcroft ignored the mud ruining her imported leather shoes. She did not look at the rusted steel drums. She walked directly toward the loading dock, her eyes locked onto the airfield manager, with the intensity of a predator assessing a very small, very loud insect. Who are you? Broderick stammered, his bravado dissolving instantly. Sloane stopped at the bottom of the metal stairs. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. My name is Sloane Whitcroft. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Cobalt Aeronautics. And if you ever raise your voice to this man again, I will buy this miserable strip of cracked asphalt before lunchtime, fire you, and bulldoze that office with your desk still in it. Broderick's face drained of all color. He took a clumsy step backward, nearly tripping over a stack of wooden pallets. He knew the name Cobalt. Everyone in aviation knew Cobalt. He swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he lowered his coffee cup. Sloane dismissed him from her reality. She turned slowly in the freezing rain to look at Garrett Kinsley. Garrett was still standing by the heavy steel drum. He wasn't looking at Sloane. His eyes were focused entirely on the small boy walking slowly across the wet gravel. Elias was ignoring the rain. He was ignoring his mother. He walked straight toward the massive, broad-shouldered man in the canvas jacket. His little designer boots splashed through the freezing puddles until he stopped just a few feet away. Elias looked up, clutching his small, blue stuffed bear tightly against his chest. Garrett dropped to one knee. The thick, freezing mud soaked instantly into the fabric of his jeans, but he didn't care. The stone-cold expression he had worn while hauling heavy freight melted away entirely. Hey there, racehorse, Garrett said. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble, warm enough to push back the freezing chill of the morning. Elias didn't say a word. He just stepped forward and buried his face into the rough canvas of Garrett's jacket, wrapping his small arms around the man's neck. Sloane felt the breath leave her lungs. She stood in the rain, watching her son, a boy who suffered from crippling anxiety, who flinched at loud noises, who rarely let anyone touch him, willingly seek out the embrace of a man he had met. Exactly once. Garrett didn't hesitate. He wrapped one massive arm around the boy's back, shielding him from the wind and the rain. His large hand rested gently on the back of Elias's head. You're a long way from home, Garrett murmured softly. You keeping your engine running smooth? Elias nodded against Garrett's shoulder. I brought you my bear. So you wouldn't get scared of the loud noises either. Garrett closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The deep, unspoken pain in his face was visible to Sloane, a flash of profound loss that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He pulled back slightly, looking Elias in the eyes, and gave the boy a genuine, gentle smile. That is a very brave bear, Garrett said softly. But you keep him. You're the captain. He needs you more than I do. Garrett slowly stood up. He gently guided Elias back toward Sloane, placing himself between the boy and the bitter wind. Then he finally looked at the billionaire CEO standing in his muddy reality. You shouldn't have come here, Ms. Whitcroft, Garrett said quietly. His voice had lost its warmth. It was respectful but completely guarded. I came to apologize, Sloane said, her voice tight. Julian Sterling has been terminated. He will never step foot in a Cobalt facility again. What he did to you, what he said to you, was unacceptable. Garrett wiped the rain from his jaw. He looked past her, glancing at the manager's office window, where Maya was still pressing her face against the glass, watching her father. I don't need an apology, Garrett said flatly. I need an hourly wage to feed my daughter. Come back with me, Sloane said. The desperation in her own voice surprised her. Not to the hangar floor. come work directly for me. At the corporate tower. I will triple whatever this place was paying you. I will give you full benefits, secure housing, whatever you want. Garrett looked at her. His eyes were unreadable, dark and heavy with secrets she couldn't begin to understand. I don't want your money. Your world is built on noise and ego. I keep my daughter away from both. Garrett, please, before Sloane could finish her sentence, a terrifying sound tore through the heavy clouds above them. It was a high-pitched, grinding scream of tearing metal and failing machinery. Everyone on the ground froze. Broderick dropped his coffee cup. It shattered on the metal dock. Breaking through the low gray overcast was a twin-engine cargo plane. It was coming in completely sideways. Thick, black smoke was billowing violently from the right engine, leaving a dark scar across the stormy sky. The wind was howling, pushing the crippled aircraft violently off the center line of the runway. Broderick panicked. He grabbed the heavy radio clipped to his belt, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't find the transmit button. He's coming in too hot. The landing gear is jammed. He's going to slide off the asphalt and hit the fuel tanks. Sloane felt her heart slam against her ribs. She grabbed Elias, pulling him tightly against her legs. Garrett did not panic. The quiet, gentle father vanished. In the span of a single second, the man who had been patiently comforting a child transformed into something entirely terrifying. His posture locked into rigid, predatory focus. Garrett lunged across the distance, grabbing the radio straight out of Broderick's trembling hands. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't hesitate. He keyed the microphone, his voice cutting through the panic like a steel blade. Unidentified twin engine, this is ground. You are carrying too much speed and a heavy right side drag. Do not attempt a flare. Cut your right throttle completely. Bank 10 degrees left and let the crosswind catch your dead wing. Broderick stared at him in absolute shock. You can't give orders on that frequency. You're a janitor. Garrett ignored him. He kept his eyes locked on the smoking plane hurtling toward the earth. He keyed the mic again, his voice carrying the absolute, unquestionable authority of a man who had commanded airspace in war zones. Pilot, listen to my voice. Drop the nose. You are stalling. Drop the nose right now and brace for a hard deck. Sloane watched, completely paralyzed, as the man she had hired to empty trash cans commanded the sky. The heavy plastic radio in Garrett's hand cracked with a burst of panic static. Ground, this is Cargo Flight 29er. I have total hydraulic failure. The right engine is gone, the yoke is locked, I cannot pull the nose up. We are going into the dirt. The voice on the other end was frantic, screaming over the sound of blaring cockpit alarms. In the freezing rain, the massive twin-engine plane was plunging out of the sky, its wings wobbling violently. It was completely out of control, rocketing toward the muddy asphalt at a terrifying speed. Broderick Hayes fell to his knees on the loading dock, covering his head, preparing for the massive explosion. Sloane Whitcroft dropped to the wet gravel, pulling Elias tightly against her chest, her heart hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She squeezed her eyes shut, entirely helpless. But Garrett did not move. He stood tall in the freezing rain, a solitary pillar of absolute calm in the middle of the chaos. He pressed the transmit button. His voice was no longer the quiet, gentle tone of a father, nor the guarded voice of a laborer. It was a command frequency. It was a voice that had orchestrated life and death in skies halfway across the world. 29er, stop fighting the yoke, Garrett ordered, his voice slicing straight through the pilot's panic. You are wasting your time and bleeding your altitude. Let go of the controls. Are you insane? The pilot screamed back. If I let go, we nosedive. If you fight a locked hydraulic line, you snap the steering column and you die. Garrett fired back, his tone carrying an immovable, terrifying authority. Cut your left engine, now. Kill the power entirely. I'll drop like a stone. You will drop flat, Garrett commanded. Kill the throttle. Let the crosswind hit the dead wing. The wind will push your nose up for you. Do it right now, pilot, or you will not survive the next 10 seconds. The radio went dead. For 3 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the screaming wind. Then, the whine of the left engine abruptly choked off. The plane dropped violently, plummeting toward the earth. Sloane gasped, bracing her son for the impact. But just as the nose threatened to smash into the concrete, a massive gust of freezing wind slammed into the side of the aircraft. Exactly as Garrett had predicted, the wind caught the dead wing. The nose of the massive plane violently pitched upward. It wasn't a graceful maneuver. It was a brutal, desperate manipulation of gravity. The aircraft slammed into the muddy asphalt. The impact was deafening. Thick black tires exploded into shreds of rubber. The metal belly of the plane shrieked against the ground, throwing a massive, blinding shower of orange sparks and freezing mud into the air. The crippled plane skidded sideways, tearing through a rusted chain-link fence, violently spinning before finally grinding to a violent, shuddering halt just 30 feet away from the highly explosive fuel tanks. Silence slammed back into the airfield, broken only by the sound of the rain and the hiss of smoking metal. Sloane slowly opened her eyes. Her entire body was trembling. She looked past the destroyed fence, staring at the smoking wreckage of the massive cargo plane. Then, she looked up at Garrett. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't ducked. He was already lowering the radio, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. He looked at the smoking plane, nodded once to himself, and tossed the radio onto a stack of wooden pallets. Instantly, the terrifying, authoritative commander vanished. Garrett turned his back on the millions of dollars of smoking machinery. He dropped straight down into the freezing mud, rushing towards Sloane and Elias. Elias was sobbing, his hands clamped tightly over his ears, terrified by the deafening screech of the metal. Garrett didn't hesitate. He pulled the trembling billionaire's son into his broad chest, wrapping his arms around him. "It's over, racehorse," Garrett whispered, his voice instantly returning to that deep, vibrating warmth. "The noise is gone. The thunder passed. You did so good. You were so brave." From the manager's office, the door banged open. Maya ran out into the rain, clutching her yellow plastic airplane. She didn't look at the crashed plane. She ran straight to her father. Garrett opened his arm, catching his daughter and pulling her against his other side. He knelt there in the freezing mud, holding both children, shielding them from the cold, the rain, and the fear. Sloane sat on the wet gravel, entirely breathless. She was the CEO of an aviation empire. She commanded thousands of engineers. Yet, she had never seen anything like this. She had just watched a man wearing a dirty canvas jacket manually rewrite the laws of physics with his voice, save 2 lives, and instantly return to being a gentle, comforting father. Her money, her status, her power, it all felt entirely insignificant next to the raw, undeniable capability of the man kneeling in front of her. Across the muddy lot, the heavy cargo door of the crashed plane kicked open. The emergency slide deployed, and a man stumbled down to the wet ground. It was the pilot. He was an older man with graying hair and a leather flight jacket, bleeding from a deep cut above his left eye. He was coughing, shaking violently, staring at the wreckage of his own aircraft. Broderick Hayes finally scrambled to his feet, pale and hyperventilating. The pilot, Captain Silas Thorne, marched through the mud toward the loading dock. He ignored the ruined plane. He ignored the freezing rain. He walked straight up to Broderick, his chest heaving. "Who was on the comms?" Silas demanded, his voice cracking with adrenaline. "Who the hell was on the radio?" Broderick couldn't speak. He just pointed a shaking, terrified finger at the man kneeling in the mud with the children. Silas Thorne turned. He wiped the blood out of his eyes, squinting through the heavy rain. He walked slowly toward Garrett. Garrett heard the footsteps. He gently pulled back from the children, kissing Maya's forehead. He stood up, wiping the mud from his jeans, and turned to face the pilot. Silas stopped 10 feet away. He stared at the broad-shouldered man in the faded work jacket. He looked at Garrett's posture, the unmistakable, disciplined way he stood. Silas's eyes widened. All the color drained from the older pilot's face. The anger and adrenaline completely vanished, replaced by an expression of absolute, breathless awe. Silas instinctively straightened his spine. He brought his boots together in the mud. He didn't reach out to shake Garrett's hand. He braced his body into a rigid, flawless military salute. "My God," Silas whispered, his voice trembling over the sound of the rain. "They told us you were gone. They said you disappeared 3 years ago." Broderick stared in total confusion. Sloane slowly stood up, her heart stopping in her chest. "You wrote the emergency glide protocols for the entire Pacific Fleet," Silas continued, his voice thick with overwhelming respect. "I flew your designs in the desert. We all did. You're the one who engineered the ether blueprint." Sloane felt the air leave her lungs. The ether blueprint. The exact prototype aircraft sitting in her private hangar. The billion-dollar machine she thought her own engineers had created. Silas lowered his shaking hand, staring at the man who had just saved his life. "It is an absolute honor to be on the ground with you, Commander Kinsley." The freezing rain continued to hammer the cracked asphalt of the Blackwood airfield, but the silence following Silas Thorne's words felt absolute. Broderick Hayes stood on the edge of the loading dock, his mouth hanging open, his face the color of wet ash. He looked from the smoking wreckage of the multi-million-dollar cargo plane to the muddy, broad-shouldered man he had spent the last 3 hours screaming at. Garrett Kinsley did not look at the stunned manager. He didn't look at the smoking aircraft. And he didn't look at the billionaire CEO standing frozen to his left. He stepped forward, his boots sinking into the mud, and gently pushed Silas's rigid, trembling hand down from its salute. "Put your hand down, Silas," Garrett said. His voice was low, carrying no ego, no demand for respect. It was just heavy with exhaustion. "I'm not a commander anymore. I'm just a father." "They told us you were dead," Silas whispered, his voice cracking as the adrenaline finally gave way to shock. "When you vanished from the design bureau, Pentagon wiped the files. We thought you went down in a test flight. I went home, Garrett corrected quietly. He squeezed the older pilot's shoulder. You flew a dead stick into a crosswind, Silas. You did good. Go wait for the paramedics. Garrett turned his back on the pilot and the burning wreckage. He walked directly toward Broderick. The airfield manager flinched, shrinking back against the metal siding of his office. McKinsley, I swear I didn't know who you were. If I had known you were military, I would never have. Garrett didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten the man. He simply stopped, looking at Broderick with eyes that were terrifyingly empty of any warmth. The fact that you needed to know my rank before deciding to treat me like a human being is exactly why I'm walking away, Garrett said softly. He didn't wait for a response. He walked past the trembling manager, scooped his daughter into his left arm, and extended his right hand to Elias. The little boy didn't hesitate. He grabbed Garrett's calloused, mud-stained hand, holding on with white-knuckled desperation. Sloane Whitcroft watched the exchange, her chest tight, her breath catching in her throat. She had spent her entire adult life surrounded by men who demanded the spotlight, men who would have milked this moment of glory for everything it was worth. Garrett had just performed an impossible miracle, and all he cared about was getting two frightened children out of the cold. "My car," Sloane said, her voice shaking slightly. She pointed to the massive armored black SUV waiting on the gravel. "Get them out of the wind, please." For once, Garrett didn't argue. The interior of the SUV was a sanctuary of heat and thick, soundproofed glass. The heavy doors slammed shut, instantly cutting off the screaming wind and the distant sirens. Garrett sat on the pristine, imported white leather seats. He was covered in freezing gray mud, heavy grease, and a thin streak of blood from the falling iron the night before. He was ruining thousands of dollars worth of upholstery just by sitting there. Sloane sat across from him and didn't care at all. She pulled a heavy, heated cashmere blanket from a compartment and draped it over Maya, who was shivering against her father's chest. Elias had refused to sit next to his mother. He was pressed firmly against Garrett's other side, his face buried in the rough, wet canvas of Garrett's jacket. Garrett rested his large hands on the back of each child's head, his thumbs drawing slow, rhythmic circles. He closed his eyes, his breathing slowing down, bringing the energy in the vehicle from a state of pure panic to a quiet, anchored calm. Sloane watched him. Her hands were still shaking. She was one of the most powerful women in the country, but looking at Garrett, she felt entirely small. "You built the ether," Sloane whispered, the reality finally setting in. The ambient hum of the vehicle's heater filled the space between her words. "My board of directors spent $2 billion trying to understand the thermal stress limits of that rotor housing. And you were washing the floors beneath it." Garrett didn't open his eyes. "The math is easy, Ms. Whitcroft. It's just numbers. Living with what the math is used for. That's the hard part. Why did you leave?" she asked softly. "You were at the absolute pinnacle of aviation engineering. You had the Pentagon writing you blank checks." Garrett finally opened his eyes. They were dark, carrying a profound, quiet sorrow. "Because my wife got sick," Garrett said, his voice dropping to a low, heavy rumble. "And while she was in a hospital bed, I was halfway across the world, testing prototype weapons that I designed to break the sky. I spent my life building perfect machines. And when it mattered most, I couldn't fix the only thing I cared about." Sloane stopped breathing. "When she passed," Garrett continued, looking down at Maya's sleeping face, "I realized none of it mattered. The noise, the titles, the money. It's all just an illusion. I took Maya, I burned my clearances, and I disappeared. I promised her I would never prioritize a piece of metal over her again." The words struck Sloane with the force of a physical blow. She looked at her son, clinging to a stranger for the safety he couldn't find in her. She had spent Elias's entire life building metal birds. She had given him nannies, trust funds, and security details, but she had never given him the quiet, immovable peace that Garrett Kinsley radiated naturally. "I have everything," Sloane whispered, a single tear breaking free and tracking down her cheek. "I own the sky, and I couldn't even stop my own son from having a panic attack." Garrett looked up. For the first time, he didn't look at her like a cold, untouchable CEO. He looked at her like a human being. "Power doesn't make you safe," Garrett said gently. "It just makes the storms bigger. You don't need to control the sky to make him feel safe. You just need to be his ground." The SUV pulled through a massive set of wrought iron gates, ascending a winding, tree-lined driveway before stopping in front of the Beaumont estate. Sloane's private, sprawling stone mansion hidden in the hills. The heavy oak doors opened instantly. Evelyn Vance, Sloane's elderly, fiercely loyal housekeeper, rushed out with dry towels. She took one look at the muddy, imposing man carrying the two sleeping children and immediately stepped aside, sensing the undeniable authority in the way he moved. An hour later, the children were asleep in a massive guest suite, exhausted by the adrenaline of the morning. Garrett stepped out of the adjoining bathroom. He had showered, washing away the mud and grease. He was wearing a pair of dark jeans and a plain gray sweater Evelyn had found in storage. Stripped of the dirty canvas jacket, his physical presence was staggering. He moved through the luxurious multi-million-dollar estate with complete ease. He wasn't intimidated by the wealth. He had clearly stood in rooms like this before. He walked into the massive, glass-walled living room. Sloane was standing by the fireplace, staring out at the storm. She had changed into a soft, dark silk robe, looking entirely stripped of her corporate armor. She looked vulnerable, exhausted, and incredibly beautiful. She turned as he approached, holding out a crystal glass of expensive amber bourbon. Garrett took it. Their fingers brushed. The spark of heat was undeniable. Julian was going to run those engines yesterday, Sloane said softly, staring into her glass. If you hadn't left that piece of cardboard on the staging tray, if you hadn't stepped in, people would have died. Garrett took a slow sip. You stopped the test. You grounded your own flagship project. Most people in your position would have let the blade spin, just to protect their ego. Sloane looked up, her piercing eyes locking onto his. The emotional walls she had spent a decade building were completely gone. I didn't ground the plane because I understood the math, Garrett, she whispered, stepping a fraction of an inch closer. I grounded it because I listened to you. The ambient heat of the massive stone fireplace wrapped around them, pushing back the bitter chill of the Oregon storm outside. Garrett stood perfectly still, holding the crystal glass of bourbon, his dark eyes locked onto Sloane's. She had just admitted what no one in her entire ruthless cutthroat world would ever dare to confess. She had grounded a billion-dollar empire not because of data, not because of computer models, but because she trusted the intuition of a man she barely knew. Garrett slowly reached forward and took the heavy crystal glass from her trembling fingers. He set it on the marble mantel. He looked at her, truly looking past the expensive silk robe, past the title of CEO, past the icy armor she wore to survive in a world of greedy men. He saw a mother who had spent her entire life terrified of failing her child. He lifted his hand. His broad, calloused fingers brushed gently against her jawline. You never had to be perfectly strong, Garrett whispered, his thumb slowly wiping a fresh tear from her cheek. You just had to be there. You don't have to carry the sky alone anymore. Sloane closed her eyes, leaning the weight of her face into the warmth of his palm. For the first time in a decade, the crushing, suffocating pressure in her chest released. She wasn't standing in a boardroom. She wasn't fighting for her company. She was just a woman, standing in front of a man who offered an immovable, unconditional safety. By 9 o'clock the following morning, that peace was entirely shattered. The executive boardroom on the top floor of the Cobalt Aeronautics Tower felt like a glass cage. The heavy mahogany table was surrounded by 12 of the most powerful, ruthless investors on the West Coast. At the head of the table stood Harrison Caldwell. Harrison was the billionaire chairman of the board, a man whose greed was matched only by his arrogance. He slammed a thick legal dossier onto the polished wood, his face red with fury. This is a vote of no confidence, Harrison roared, his voice echoing off the glass walls. You have lost your mind, Sloane. You grounded the Ether 9 prototype on the eve of our biggest defense contract review. You publicly fired Julian Sterling. And for what? Because you listened to a man who mops the hangar floors. Sloane sat in her leather chair, wearing a dark tailored suit. Her face was a mask of cold stone, but inside, her pulse was hammering. She had no technical data to present. She only had the grease-stained cardboard with Garrett's warning. The atmospheric temperature dropped to a critical level, Sloane said evenly. The titanium housing would have failed. I prevented a catastrophic loss of life. You prevented our stock from climbing 30%, Harrison spat, pacing like a caged tiger. The military buyers are threatening to pull their funding. You are emotionally compromised. We are stripping you of your executive authority right now. The Ether 9 engines will be spooled up in exactly 1 hour. If you start those engines, Sloane warned, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, the metal will shear. People will die. Security will escort you to your car, Harrison sneered, pressing the intercom button on the table. You're done, Sloane. Before the intercom could connect, the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom did not just open. They were commanded open. Sloane gasped. Garrett Kinsley stepped into the room. He wasn't wearing a faded canvas work jacket. He wasn't covered in freezing mud. He was wearing an immaculate charcoal gray tailored suit that stretched perfectly across his broad shoulders. He walked with the terrifying predatory grace of a man who owned the very ground he stepped on. The quiet, humble laborer was entirely gone. In his place was the apex predator of the aviation world. And walking exactly one step behind him was a man in a heavily decorated 4-star military uniform. General Arthur Kensington, the absolute highest authority in the Department of Defense. What is the meaning of this? Harrison shouted, his face turning purple. Guards, get this janitor out of my boardroom immediately. General Kensington stepped forward, his eyes burning with absolute disgust. Sit down and shut your mouth, Harrison, or I will have military police drag you out of this tower by your expensive tie. The room froze. The billionaire investors stared in absolute shock. Harrison slowly sank into his leather chair, the color completely draining from his face. Garrett walked slowly toward the center of the table. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely devastatingly in control. He dropped a heavy black military file onto the table. It landed with a loud final thud. The Ether 9, Garrett said, his voice a low, heavy rumble that vibrated through the silent room, operates on a highly classified variable pitch rotor system. A system that belongs to me. Harrison stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. That's impossible. You sweep the hangars. I sweep the hangars, Garrett replied, his eyes turning to black ice, because I prefer the quiet. But I designed the engine you are so desperate to turn on. I ran the math. And if you had turned it on yesterday, the thermal shear would have shattered the housing at 400 rotations per minute. You would have killed everyone in the observation gallery, including yourselves. The board members went dead silent. A wave of sickening realization washed over the room. General Kensington placed his hands on the table, leaning forward. Commander Kinsley is the most highly decorated classified aviation architect in the history of the armed forces. He holds the exclusive patent to the Ether technology. And as of 10 minutes ago, he has officially revoked Cobalt's licensing rights to use it. Blind panic erupted around the table. The billionaires began shouting, realizing that billions of dollars were evaporating into thin air before their very eyes. Cobalt Aeronautics was essentially dead. Garrett raised a single commanding hand. The room instantly fell completely silent. They hung on his every breath. There is one condition, Garrett said softly. He didn't look at Harrison. He didn't look at the board. His eyes shifted and landed entirely on Sloan. The coldness vanished, replaced by a fierce, undeniable protection. The patent remains with Cobalt, Garrett commanded. The military contracts remain with Cobalt, but only under the condition that Sloan Whitcroft retains absolute, unquestioned executive control over every single operation in this company. She makes the calls. She grounds the planes. If a single board member challenges her authority ever again, I will bury this company in the dirt before the stock market opens. Harrison Caldwell swallowed hard. His arrogance was completely shattered. He looked down at the table, nodding weakly. The coup was crushed. Garrett turned to Sloan. He extended his hand. Sloan stood up. She didn't look back at the billionaires who had just tried to destroy her. She reached out and took Garrett's hand, feeling the rough calluses on his fingers, feeling the incredible, immovable safety he offered. They walked out of the boardroom together, side by side, leaving the most powerful men in the city sitting in stunned, terrified silence. 6 weeks later, the noise of the corporate world felt like a distant memory. The afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over the sprawling, private green meadow behind the Beaumont estate. The wind was gentle, rustling through the tall trees. Elias was running. He was laughing loudly, a bright, joyous sound that Sloan had once feared she would never hear. He was chasing Maya across the grass. The little girl was holding her yellow plastic airplane high above her head, weaving through the wind, completely carefree. Sloan sat on a soft-woven blanket, wearing a simple white sweater and faded jeans. Her phone was locked inside the house. She didn't care about the stock market. She didn't care about the board of directors. Garrett sat beside her in the grass. He leaned back on his hands, watching the children play with a soft, profound peace resting in his dark eyes. The heavy, suffocating weight he had carried for 3 long years was finally gone. He didn't have to hide anymore. He didn't have to carry the grief alone. Sloan looked at him, admiring the quiet, immovable strength in his profile. She reached out, sliding her hand across the blanket, and gently tangled her fingers with his. Garrett turned his head. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, burning fire that chased away the last remnants of the cold. He leaned in, his hand coming up to cup the side of her face, and his lips brushed softly against hers. It was a slow, deliberate kiss, completely free of fear, completely anchored in trust. "It's finally quiet," Sloan whispered against his lips. Garrett smiled, pulling her closer against his broad chest as they watched their children run through the sunlit grass. "We fly above the thunder, Sloan," Garrett murmured softly. "Always."